Hello, everybody. Let me introduce you Dr. Moshe Behar. Moshe is the head of Arabic and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Manchester, United Kingdom. Thank you so much, Moshe, to have this conversation with me. I believe that this can contribute to my students at the University of Wollongong, Australia. Just to a few words about the subject these students are taking with me. It is titled The Politics of the Middle East, though we mainly focus on the Zionist-Palestinian conflict, and we adopt, for the sake of this subject, the settled colonial framework. So we try to explain the advent of Zionism in Palestine from late 19th century using the settler native paradigm in order to explain the developments of events ever since. I would like to tell my students that you have published extensively on modern Jewish thought and also on the history and politics of Middle Eastern Jews, particularly in relation to our own focus, the Zionist-Palestinian conflict. And this is why, in fact, I ask you to have this conversation to, I believe, also to diversify a bit the kind of material students have towards their preparation in this subject, and also for the exam that we are going to have in a month. And the topic of our conversation today will be touching up on several themes around this triangular relationship between the Mizrahi, Sephardim, the Zionist Ashkenazim, and the Palestinian people, as this triangle of relationship unfolded in Palestine since late 19th century. So without further ado, let me go straight forward to my first question to you, Moshe. And let me tell you that during the first weeks of our semester, we have been touching upon the pre-Zionist era in Palestine, that is when Sephardim and Mizrahim, Middle Eastern Jewish communities in Palestine, as they were a small minority, still they sustain what can be called quite a good harmony in their relationship with the Arab Palestinian majority, both Muslims and Christians. First of all, we discussed that because I believe that's a very important period of time that is missing, sadly so, in Israeli education itself. So most Jewish Israelis have very little idea, if at all, of this period. So my question to you, if you could elaborate on what is, in your opinion, the historical and political legacy of that shared form of life that Jews and Arabs maintained before the advent of Zionism?
Yes, first of all, thank you very much, Marcel, for hosting me, and I'm quite happy to speak to some extent directly to students in Australia. I had a chance to spend some time there when I was your age, and in a way I feel that it closes few issues with me. So, I mean, in my view, the most important element in relation to the question that I was asked is the fact that we are speaking about A, an empire, B, the Ottoman Empire. This is a critical issue to understand pre-Zionist relationships between Jews and non-Jews. I'm even hesitant to use the word Palestinian, because it's a phase where you can equally say Greater Syria, you can say Southern Syria. It's an empire. There's no demarcation of states. So, and this is, I think, the most important issue. And the place is an empire for 400 years. This is a very, very long time. Sometimes I say to my own students, think of the Israel-Palestine question, it is about 130, 140 years. What's going to happen 3 times as long in relation to this question in the future? So people will understand. We are talking now about a chapter that is 400 years. That's how important it is. And the Ottoman Empire was, in a way, existed even longer than the Roman Empire in the Middle East. So what I'm suggesting here, this is very important to bear this in mind. Now, I suspect that most young people, including ourselves here, tend to be anti-colonialist in the sense that they understand that colonialism is problematic, and also people tend to self-define themselves as anti-imperialists, right? Now, I would now try to do something a bit risky. I'm going to differentiate between the two. Anti-colonialism, no problem, I don't need to talk about it, but anti-imperialism is a little bit more complicated. Why? Because you need to understand that sometimes for communities and individuals, let alone members of minority communities, sometimes they prefer to be part of an empire. Think about it. I'm in the UK right now. I'm still part of the EU. You can think of the European Union as an empire of sorts. Yeah. Why is it nice to be part of the EU, of this empire? Because empire is not like the little island of England, which is conservative. Empire, it has Portugal and Spain and the Netherlands, and I can go there. I can move around, So now, if you're a member of a minority community, especially Jews and Christians in the Ottoman Empire, you have a space to breathe. So anti-imperialism, yes, if it's political, but the structure of a space that is big is not necessarily bad. It's actually, sometimes it can be nice and beneficial. And what I suggest to you is the Jews in the Ottoman Empire and the coexistence that existed in the Ottoman Empire was partially a consequence of the fact that people could move around. So for example, if you were an Orthodox Jew and you did want to go to Jerusalem to do X, Y, Z, you could, you go, spend a month, 2 months, and that's it. Thank you very much. I'm going back home. So why? Because Morocco, Yemen, Iraq, and Jerusalem is part of the same entity. You don't need papers. You don't need passports. You are in the same place, the same empire. So that's the first thing. Empire can be beneficial to minority-majority relations. Not always, but can. Now, the Ottoman Empire, because of its specific communitarian organization, was a very relatively tolerant empire. The Ottomans were occupiers in the Arab Middle East. They come from Turkey, but their presence in the Arab Middle East is relatively benevolent because they share religion with the Arabs, right? There's a difference linguistically, but they also share quite a lot. And in some respects, I mean, the fact that the Ottoman Empire is informed to some extent by the precepts of Islam, it also means, as Sunni Islam, yeah, it also means that that Islamic tendencies are present. And this is something very important to bear in mind, because unlike the built-in tension that exists between Judaism and Christianity, there's no similar tension between Islam and Judaism. Islam has no problem with Judaism. Islam, I mean, the Quran is the final revelation of God. It's not the only revelation of God. So the Bible is fine, Jews are fine, Moses is fine. It's just an extension of it. So it's inclusive of Jews. So there's no, so in a way, this in a way generates a much more constructive Jewish-Muslim relations, including in Palestine, of course. So I think these are the main reasons that in comparative terms, intergroup or interreligious relationship in the Ottoman Empire score much better when compared to other empires in the world.
Thank you.
But this is before Zionism.
Right. Yes, thank you. Just a few comments before we move on. Just touching up on your last sentence, and in the class we compare this experience that you were describing within the boundaries of the Ottoman Empire, also in Palestine, and contrasted it with the experience of Jewish communities in Europe, villages all up to early modernity, and how when we talk about anti-Semitism, that concept must be described properly in the context of not just of particular history, but of particular places. And talking about anti-Semitism cannot be done in the same way when we refer to this great difference between the experiences of European Jews versus Middle Eastern Jews in Arab and Muslim countries. And thank you also for mentioning that issue of the spatiality of an empire. In one of our classes, we were looking into the significance of the Hejaz railways, yes, and how they connected people within the Ottoman Empire in Greater Syria, southern Greater Syria, and the potentialities of life that these railways offer, and how, in fact, all this disappeared with the end of the British mandate and the establishment of the State of Israel. So thank you again, Moshe. I'll jump, historically speaking, quite a bit now, and into our this week lecture. And we were this week talking about the Black Panthers in Israel, yeah, and the significance of this group in terms of Mizrahi resistance. And I'm curious to hear your opinion. First of all, if you can perhaps paint for us the background of their emergence in Israel, of the Black Panthers, and also to say a word about their political platform in relation to the Palestinian question.
All right, so let's just make a little bridge between the previous question and this one, although of course we are covering many, yes, decades, but because there was no Jewish question in the Ottoman Empire and the Arab Middle East in the same way that a Jewish question, so to speak, existed in Europe, this also meant the Jews in the Middle East did not need to work hard in order to formulate responses to racism that the European Jews faced, because Zionism, in a way, is trying to address an issue that is European. Zionism, you need to say European Zionism. So now why this is important? Because these people that we're going to discuss now, Black Panthers and Mizrahim in general, they do not come into Israel from an ideological heritage of political Zionism. This is very important. So that's one thing. So what happened is this, right? After the Nakba, after 1948, the situation of minority communities of Jews in countries surrounding mandatory Palestine becomes a little bit more complicated. Okay, they are the Zionist Palestinian issue in Palestine in a way sucks in Muslims and Christians and Jews in neighboring countries. At a certain point, the contradiction becomes too hard to sustain, and we are not going to discuss it. Why? About 2/3 of the Jews that live in states that are neighboring Palestine, Israel, find their way into Israel from 1950 onwards, and 1/3 of them ends up in Western Europe, South America, Canada, elsewhere. We are talking here about 500 people. So 500,000
people, yeah.
500,000 people now move and find themselves in the young European, Eurocentric state of Israel in the 1950s. Now, this is quite a lot because numerically speaking, it also means that the Jewish population of the young state of Israel increases by nearly 100%, right? And the people that are now coming to this place are people that are different ethnically, they have different ideologies, they have different way that they exercise religion, they have a different language, they are Arab or Arabized Jews. These are Jews from non-European Jews. They end up in a Eurocentric Israel. They come there penniless. You need to bear this in mind. They don't have, it's not immigration here. It's shifts. It's in some respect, it's a, you can say it's a secondary effect of the Nakba, in a way, it's like a chain reaction. So they arrive there, and what happened now that this community becomes totally dependent upon the Eurocentric and European-dominated Zionist Israel, right, for their livelihood. These people don't have jobs, they don't have profession, they don't have income, right? So they begin to, in a way, be a process of proletarianization takes place. These people now become, in the new place, they become the working class in a way of the newly established Israeli Zionist Eurocentric state, right? So you have now a very tight correlation between ethnic origin, namely non-European ethnic origin, Jews from the Middle East, and class position. So if you can tell, you can see that European Jews now occupy the lower classes in Israel, whereas European Zionists or European Jews occupy, they are the bosses, so to speak. And the Black Panther, in some respects, not all of them, but symbolically speaking, you can think of the Black Panthers, of the generation of the Black Panthers, as the first Mizrahi Israelis. They are first generation Israelis, so to speak. Of course, that some of them, few of them could have been born elsewhere, but anyway, they were young, So what we are talking about? We are talking here about 1970, 1971. These people are more or less 20, 21 years old and more. So you can see, if you do the calculation, these are people that were born around 1948, 1947, and sometimes before. So in a way, these are the first. So these are the people that, in many respects, first generation of, not immigrants. That's not right to say immigrants, but the first generation of a community that lost all of its history, heritage, context, and was drawn into a place that is very conservative, very East European. It's not even European, by the way.
Yeah.
We're talking about Polish and Russian state. That's what it is. It's not even English or Western, right? So this is the tension, and this is why they are living great poverty. They don't have opportunities. It is a really quintessential working class uprising, right? Although in this case, of course, it is very much linked to ethnicity. So this is the background of the Black Panthers, seeing that their parents are completely dependent upon the state. They have no independence, they have no prospects, they have no education, they live in very cramped city. Usually they're also placed in the periphery, I mean, either in the borders between Arab states neighboring Palestine and Israel, or in the borders of, for example, East Jerusalem. After 1967, they are placed always at the front of the Arab and the Palestinian world, in a way. They become really part and parcel of the tension between the two sides. So that's what happens. That's the background for the Black Panthers, and they revolt. Now, in terms of their politics, they are definitely radical. They see themselves as part of the new left. This is the period, think about this period. You're talking about the late 1960s, early 1970s. Think of Che Guevara, think of the new left, think of the Beatles, think of rock and roll, think of the revolt of the youngsters. I mean, so the Black Panthers in the US, Malcolm X, the civil rights movement. The Black Panthers in Israel should be understood in terms of world history as part of this process.
And could you add a word, Moshe, about their position on the Palestinian question?
Yes. So the interesting, no, not the interesting thing, but the Black Panthers are, you can define them as a classic case of a left-oriented uprising. These are people, right, that are able to make a link between their own marginal position inside the Jewish Zionist state of Israel. On the one hand, they do see themselves as victims. There's no question about it, right? And interestingly enough, because of that, they are also able to provide, and I'm talking here, this is the early 70s, there are almost no other constituencies in the state of Israel that are able to empathize in a way with the situation of the Palestinian victims of Zionism. Right? Of course, you have marginal leftist groups that are pro-Palestinians, but numerically speaking, right, in terms of numbers, it's very symbolic. You know, this is, by the way, this is very important because the Black Panthers is a movement. It's a movement that can resonate with masses inside Israeli society, whereas the more polished Ashkenazi or European leftists, including those that are outside of Zionism, they are people that are very impressive in terms of their morality, in terms of their political analysis, but in terms of macro sociopolitics, they don't have a weight. This is why the state of Israel is not afraid so much of non or anti-Zionist Jews, but it's very, very much afraid of the Black Panthers, because the Black Panthers, if they are successful, they can generate a revolution. That's the issue here.
And we should add that the political marginality of radical Ashkenazi anti-Zionist Jews have remained the same, more or less, these days. So very little have changed since then. And it's also interesting to characterize what you were saying about the Panthers. They were, in fact, the first intersectionalist.
In a way.
Yeah, in a way. right. And I wonder if you believe, yes, please.
Just one thing that I think is important for you and the students and everybody to understand. Listen, the Black Panthers are working class. This is very important to understand.
Mm-hmm.
The critical people that you read, Matzpen, all kinds of leftist groups, they are very great and interesting, but these people usually are not working class.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I'm also not working class. I'm an academic. Okay, I used to be working class. I'm no longer working class. But this is a very important difference because when one studies constituencies that are oppositional, right, one needs to understand, right, their economic background and where do they come from. And the Black Panthers are the only working class revolt inside the Jewish society of Israel. I'm not talking about Palestinians because that's of course a separate issue here.
Yeah.
So this is why, in a way, this hybrid between class position and ethnicity really scares the establishment inside the state of Israel, and they do all they can to try and diffuse, dissect, and destroy this emerging alternative.
So let's talk about this alternative nowadays. In the Mizrahi and Sephardic circles in Israeli society today, we say that to identify resonance with others in terms of the and activist practices of a current Mizrahi civil society.
Yes, there is a linkage between all kinds of mobilizations that take place in the 21st century. Let's be generous here. Let's go to the 21st century. There is a linkage between their type of politics and ideology and the Black Panthers. So, but this is it. Now we have to move and talk about the differences, because the differences are greater than the similarities, okay? So let's just point out to some differences. The constituencies today are by definition less radical, okay? They're less radical. They definitely do much less collective action compared to the Black Panthers. You don't have demonstrations that take over Jerusalem nowadays, as was the case with the Black Panthers in the 1970s. It doesn't exist. Now, part of the reason is that the socio-economic composition of the Mizrahi collectivity in Israel is not identical to the situation of the 1970s. So, for example, take me, I can tell you, I am the legacy of the Israel Black Panthers. But it's not exactly the case, right? Why? Because, I mean, I'm not like them because they suffered more than me. They had much less access to education than me. They were much more working class than me. They had much more at stake than me, you know what I mean? So because the Mizrahi community, we're talking about 50 years later, is not only working class, it also has middle class, and some of the academics infiltrated into the academia, and because neoliberalism changed our worlds in the last 20th, 30th century. So what I'm trying to say, it's not totally different. So this class dynamic, I think, is very important to bear in mind. This is also why in the 21st century you see Mizrahi Jews dealing much more with issues that in Marxist terms we are going to say that they are superstructural.
Yeah.
So Mizrahi Jews are going to deal with issues of culture, of art, of representation, of historical representation, These are all very, very, very important domains, let alone to a marginal group, right? But in a way, when you compare it to the 1970s, in the 1970s, the Black Panthers fight for their lives. They fight for their income. They fight for bread and butter. You know what I mean? So it's this is why. So there is an ideological linkage between the 21st century manifestation of radical Mizrahi politics and the Black Panthers, but the way it is translated into activism is very, very different, for better or worse.
Yeah, and surely, yes, and the lack of the class intersection is in fact what, in a way, reduces the chances of these kind of organizations today to reach broader publics.
Yes, and you are right. And also, by the way, you just reminded me there is another element that is important. The Black Panthers, they were not even part of the Israeli educational system because they were dropouts. You understand? They did not even, they stopped going to school at the grade 7 or 8. You know, this was themselves. Now, if you think about Mizrahim in the 21st century, well, these people went through the educational system of Israel. These people, from the second that they went to kindergarten until they completed their PhDs at the university, they are all operating in an educational system that is completely conservative, completely Zionist. You know, they are trained, or they are the way that the educational system works is exactly to neutralize, right, any opposition to the chief organizing national project or colonial project that takes place. It is not easy for a Mizrahi in the 21st century to be a non-Zionist. It's not easy because it's not just an ideological choice that you wake up in the morning and say, okay, what am I going to be today, a Zionist or a non-Zionist? No, maybe some academics can do it, right? But other people, it is a process of socialization inside Zionist institutions that all the younger generation in the 21st century was totally part of it, whereas the Black Panthers were not. You understand what I'm saying? They didn't have any commitment to Zionism.
Thank you, Moshe. We jumped from the beginning of our conversation from Ottoman times into and there to present day Mizrahi civil society organizations and groups. And now we are going to make our last jump into the elections in Israel, to the Knesset. I've been talking with my student last and this week about the still existing economic gaps between Ashkenazi Israelis and Mizrahi and Sephardi Israeli, and we are talking about third, fourth, fifth generation, if not further, and we find, according to reports, gaps in where and so on and so forth. And we see that this range of inequalities still exist. Now, when we look into the political map, we have in Israel one of the most interesting questioning political philosophy. To put it in simple terms, so why the poor votes for those political parties that at face value will not be working for them, right? And the same kind of question we have in Israel. Many candidates and academics try to resolve the big question, the $1 million question of why Mizrahim keep voting for Likud and right-wing political parties, where from a socioeconomic perspective, these parties have shown it's a proven fact that they don't have contributed much to close those inequalities I was referring to before. Now, I have my own answer to these, but I would like to, if you can share with us, what is your view on this question?
Yes, that's as you suggested, is definitely, maybe perhaps it is correct, it's the $1,000,000 question or something, a very important question. But let me first try to maybe offer us a little corrective to what you said, because remember what you have in mind here. Let's speak first only about Israel. In Israel, right, the difference between the coalition and the opposition is insignificant. What does it mean that it is insignificant? It wouldn't have changed much, right, if the Mizrahim would vote for the so-called oppositional party. Because the right wing of Zionism, Israeli Zionism, but the left wing of Zionism, the similarities are much greater than the differences. So what I suggest to you is that in many respects, it really doesn't matter if they vote for the Likud or Labor. The only way that you can break is if you vote for the Arab List party. If you vote for 95% of the possibilities that you have inside the state of Israel, with the exception of maybe the small minority group Meretz, which is truly insignificant. I mean, it's 3 member states, right? So what I suggest, it doesn't really matter, because it's the differences between the two are really insignificant also, by the way, in terms of the economic policy. You understand what I'm saying? Even economically speaking, it's not that the other side, the opposition to the right, so to speak, would somehow introduce social democratic economic policy that are going to benefit the poor, irrespective of ethnicity. So this you need to bear in mind, and everybody knows that. In many respects, by the way, sometimes the forces inside the state of Israel that are presumably left, right, have traditionally were the ones that, I mean, the Black Panthers that we just discussed, who did they revolt against? They revolt against the same parties that now you're asking me why the Mizrahim are not voting for. You understand what I'm saying? So this is one thing that I want to say, that actually I would suggest students and observer of Israel, of contemporary Israel, to relax. They should not be sucked into all this discussion about the different groups. It's a camouflage. You're not going to find there too much. But what I take from your question is, for example, how come that, let's say, Mizrahi Jews don't formulate more alliances, for example, with Palestinian Arabs in Israel? Why is it that you don't have more working class or poor non-European Mizrahi Jews voting or supporting the Palestinian party that I just mentioned? This is the question. Mm-hmm. Because if they're going to support other groups, it doesn't matter. The question is if you are able to formulate a link between deprived or working class Palestinians and working class or marginalized communities in Israel. That's the question. This is the challenge. And here, I mean, I think that that in many respects, I don't think that Mizrahi Jews or Mizrahim in Israel or non-European Jews in Israel are not that different from many other constituencies worldwide. So if you think about it, for example, How many working class poor whites in the US voted for Donald Trump? Quite a lot, you know what I mean? So we can say, wait a second, why do you vote to a neoliberal billionaire politicians that is going to only give benefit, billionaires and is not going to care much about you? Okay, let's come back to England, to the UK, where I'm right now. Listen, I suspect that many poor English people or members of the English working class, I suspect, did vote for Brexit, you know, and they voted for Brexit not because, sometimes it's because they thought that it's going to benefit them economically. I mean, maybe it will, I don't know, but I doubt it. But they also, many of them did vote for Brexit because they are unable to form, in their mind, they cannot form an alliance between themselves and immigrant labor in the UK. You understand what I'm saying? So this feature is to say, why is it that working class English, right, whites, right, don't form alliances with workers from Poland, from Romania, let alone from workers in this country that come from outside the EU, from Asia and Africa? So in a way, this is a bit of a similar dynamic. Why is it that so many Brazilians, I guess, voted for not Berlusconi,
Bolsonaro.
Bolsonaro? I confused. Let's take it. I mean, interesting. I'm sure that the students are aware to some extent of the countries that I just mentioned. But why don't we also go to Egypt, for example? You know, in Egypt, you have a lot of working class Egyptian Arabs, right, that are unable to form alliances with Black Sudanese, Arabic speaking Black Sudanese, people that come from Sudan and live in Egypt. Why? Because in Egypt also there's an issue of race. You understand? The so-called white Arabs, the Egyptian white, so to speak, right? Sometimes they're not quick to form alliances with Black Sudanese Egyptians, right? They live in Sudan. So what I'm saying, I don't have an answer to the question that you just asked, but I think that the only way to address it in the context of Israel, right, is to try and give an explanation that is comparative. What I don't like is that sometimes many observers of the question of Palestine-Israel tend to adopt a somewhat self-righteous position only vis-a-vis Mizrahi Jews, and say, why is it that you vote for Likud, whatever? So I say, what does it matter if they vote for the Likud or for Labor? It's the same thing. But now if you want to understand why they do it, right, we need to try and understand this dynamic horizontally in other places too, to see why is it that neoliberalism and nationalism, of course, right, is able to fragment marginalized members of marginalized groups, including the Mizrahim, and in a way prevents the possibility of cooperation and unity. That's the neoliberal project of fragmentation. So I don't have an answer to the question, but I think that I can suggest maybe a different way to view it, or a different lens in a way to try and devise an answer. And hopefully one of the students, you know, in 20 years' time, this is going to be their dissertation, and this is your research question, and here, step in, formulate, do the research, and you can advance us and give us, you know, new answers to questions that we're unable to properly understand and answer right now.
And certainly we have a very similar kind of question here in Australia, but I want to go back to the way you answer and related to this already historical political support of the Mizrahim with what is generally called the national camp. And the 2 points is, one, there is nevertheless a tough history between Mizrahi communities in Israel and the left camp, or the peace camp, or however you want to call it, the Ashkenazi camp, in fact. And it seems that we cannot but consider that that relationship that started with the way communities were not absorbed properly into Israel in the 50s and the 60s, and so on and so forth, and the ongoing inequality. And that kind of relationship should be part of, I believe, our explanation when we try to explain political preference. And the second point is that I personally believe that Likud and the national camp offers something that the left camp is unable to offer in terms of a national emotional attachment, a cultural space where a range of Mizrahi affects can feel at home.
Yes. I think you are right. That's I think it's part of the explanation. I mean, a lot of propaganda, of course, goes into it. You know, for example, the right in Israel, the so-called right-wing parties, including the Likud of Israel, tend to have they are much more open, for example, to Arab culture, not Arab politics, Arab music, Arab culture, not Arab politics. You know, so for example, you can, if you are, for example, linked to non-European parts of the world, historically, politically, economically, and otherwise. So the right wing in Israel says, well, we don't have a problem to allow you, for example, artistic or cultural expression of your Arabness, right? As long as you don't do political Arabness. You understand what I'm saying? Whereas if you go to the other side, the left, so to speak, in Israel, we're talking about the Zionist left, of course. The Zionist left is these people are more than the Zionist right. They truly think that they are Europeans living in the Middle East. You understand? I mean, the left in Israel is much more Eurocentric than the right, even culturally. And they truly think that they are, the Tel Aviv is New York or Sydney or Paris. You know, that's the way that they view themselves in a way. So, and Mizrahim don't fit so much because Mizrahim, even now, 2020s, are not Europeans. You know, if Mizrahim, by the way, they take a cheap flight, and which is of course available now in the 21st century, and they travel to Europe, the second that they pass the passport control and go into Italy or go into the Netherlands or go into, in 1 second they understand that they are members of the third world. You understand what I'm saying? So in a way, they have a bit of a, and I think that the Israeli right capitalized on this issue. So he allows space, symbolic representation, and also, by the way, I think that it also depoliticizes Mizrahim because they say, no, deal with all these cultural, artistic, theatrical, literary domains, but don't link them to politics. You understand what I'm saying? So, and the last thing I want to say, Marcelo, that I think is important to bear in mind, and this is, we didn't speak about it, but the power of nationalism. The power of nationalism is important, and nationalism as a mobilization that provides identity. There is one other thing that is important to understand in relation to non-European or Mizrahi Jews. You need to remember that Palestinians, right? The Palestinian Arabs was a majority group that was made into a minority group. That's what it is, right? So part of the Nakba is the fact that the Palestinian Arabs were turned into a minority, right? Mizrahi Jews is the other way around. Mizrahi Jews start with a consciousness of a minority. And by the way, to be a member of a minority is always precarious. You know, you're not the owner, you're not the boss. You're always a bit kind of, sometimes the situation is better, sometimes it's okay, you know, but you're always, you know, you're not the owner. You know, it's like being a member of a non-Christian minority in the UK or a non-white member in the UK. Presumably it's not your home. You are a bit of a guest. You understand? So now what happening to Mizrahim when they, doesn't matter now why, but once they end up in Israel, right? In their case, suddenly, despite all the manipulation, they become part of the majority group. You understand what I'm saying? And sometimes, you know, the people that were a minority group and suddenly find themselves, suddenly they are a majority group, you know, they say, we don't want to lose. Again, we do not want to reminoritize ourselves. We prefer to stick to the majority group and maintain this powerful status of being part of the majority, because of course it's great to be part of the majority. Everybody speaks your language, everybody has, you know, you go out and it's yours, you know what I mean? So this is also an element that feeds into nationalism, because nationalism is about the ability of some groups to maintain a majority position politically, economically, and otherwise. Nationalism is about that, if you think about it in terms of resources. So that is why it is very hard to convince white Americans, I suspect also working class or poor Australians, to stop your link to your own majority community and ally yourself with all those refugees, immigrants, and people from other places, minorities in a way, because if you think about it properly, maybe you have more economic or common denominators with them than you have with this imaginary majority group that you think that you are part of. You understand? So that element of minority majorities is important to incorporate into the answer of the question.
Thank you, Moshe. I totally love your use of minoritarianism versus majoritarianism, and it really is a good note here to include this idea of the Mizrahi collective desire to remain majoritarian. To remember, as I try to explain to my students, that when nowadays you look into the demographic matrix of there are, though, different Jewish Israelis practicing different practices of oppression of Palestinians, and different Jewish Israelis earn a different share of settled colonial usufruct, but the bottom line will be that they all take part in this demographic matrix, making up what the Israeli oppressor is. Yes. Moshe, I really enjoy our conversation, and I hope that we can have you once here in our Wollongong campus in the near future.
Yes, thank you so much. And yeah, I mean, I am looking forward to a possible meeting in the future.
Thank you very much, Moshe.
Okay, thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Yes.